Buon pomeriggio a tutte e tutti, sono molto lieta di ritrovarvi dopo un po' di tempo, anche se appunto non abbiamo mai lasciato in sospeso i nostri appuntamenti webinar sulla letteratura inglese. Chiamo e saluto molto volentieri il professor Cattaneo.
Buongiorno,
Presenza...
buongiorno e buongiorno a tutti e a tutte.
Buongiorno Arturo, grazie di esserci anche questa volta, ormai direi che non hai più bisogno di presentazioni e ci piace pensare che chi ci segue appunto ci segua da tanto e si porti dietro magari qualcuno che per accensione di curiosità ha voglia di sentire i nostri ragionamenti, soprattutto non i miei ma quelli del professore, che sono sempre di molto nutrimento. Ricordo solo che appunto il professor Cattaneo ci accompagna non solo da tanto tempo rispetto alla formazione di questi webinar di letteratura inglese, ma è per noi, diciamo, autore di punta della letteratura, che nella sua ultima edizione si chiama Literary Journeys, quindi è un New Literary Journeys. Connecting Ideas è la sua cifra chiave di lettura. Accendiamo sempre queste occasioni di formazione cercando ogni anno un filo conduttore che ci piace condividere con voi. Il tema di quest'oggi riguarda appunto un Long Literary Road, e quindi è The Long Literary Road to the UK, Rail Relations Act, Color Discrimination in Post-War England. Io lascio al professor Cattaneo, diciamo adesso gli lascio la parola, riprenderò alla fine del suo intervento, perché nel mentre avrò raccolto eventuali domande, suggerimenti, spunti, commenti che avrete voglia di condividere con noi. Le vostre domande possono essere inserite nella chat di YouTube. Solo un paio di informazioni di gestione di tutto quello che riguarda la vostra iscrizione, il vostro attestato di partecipazione. L'attestato di partecipazione sarà disponibile nei prossimi giorni sul sito mondadorieducation.it, lo trovate alla pagina attestati e troverete insieme al vostro attestato di partecipazione anche le slide utilizzate in questa diretta. Per chi vedesse questo evento in differita, l'attestato sarà ugualmente disponibile, ma solo ai partecipanti che avranno effettuato l'accesso dalla mail di conferma entro la mezzanotte di oggi, mentre la registrazione resterà disponibile sul nostro canale YouTube allo stesso indirizzo al quale la state vedendo in questo momento. Ringrazio nuovamente il professor Cattaneo, gli lascio e gli cedo la parola e ci vediamo alla fine dei suoi racconti. Grazie Arturo.
Grazie Laura e grazie a tutti e a tutte le presenti. Parliamo oggi di... vediamo se riesco a smuovere. Non riesco a muovere... Ecco qua. Questa Long Literary Road to the UK Race Relations Act 1976. E ne parleremo attraverso considerazioni generali, storiche e sociali, ma soprattutto, per la parte che ci interessa di più come insegnanti, attraverso tre autori in particolare. Il primo è il nigeriano Wole Soyinka, il secondo è il caraibico di origine indiana V.S. Naipaul e il terzo è Hanif Kureishi. Sono tre autori molto diversi tra di loro, non solo come scrittori, ma anche per quanto riguarda proprio questo essere diversi, nel senso di appartenere a un'etnia diversa e avere un colore diverso, in un paese che è sostanzialmente UK, il Regno Unito, ha maggioranza di popolazione bianca e di origine inglese. Poi vedremo qualche dato. Wole Soyinka, for instance, to shift to English, he's from Africa, and he was in a way a total stranger in England when he did go to England. V.S. Naipaul was from the former colonies, and in fact he was from a Commonwealth country, so he was what is usually called colonial. So we might say that he was less of a foreigner in a way. Whereas Hanif Kureishi, his father was Pakistani, and his mother was English, and he was born in England. So he's, again, quite different. He was English or British, but he did not feel to be British, not completely, as we're going to see. Now, this is the sum up of our talk today. And why do we start with the UK Race Relations Act of 1976? Because, believe it or not, but that was the first act by the UK Parliament to formally to prevent discrimination on the grounds of race, sex too, and to set up a commission for racial equality. Now, the fact is, and the point is that one thing are laws and their enforcement, and another thing are the lives of ordinary people, even when they're writers. The difference being that writers tend to record their experiences, and that's why we turn to them to learn something. And why do we start with World War II? Because before World War II, things were quite different in the sense that the number of foreign immigrants in Britain was still quite low, comparatively low. Well, to put it very simply, there were few black people living in Britain at that time. And that is why writers did not deal with that, or if they did deal with ethical themes or racial themes. There was especially for anti-Semitism, for instance, as in W.H. Auden's famous poem Refugee Blues on the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany. And things changed considerably after World War II. Why? Because many people, went to England after World War II, something we're going to see, to take a closer look at in a few seconds. But just to give you some number, I'm reading, from the 2021 census of people living in Britain. And in 2021, the census said that the people of Asian or Asian British ethnic groups were 8.6%. Black people were 3.7%, and mixed British were 2.7%, which makes up some 15%, which is quite a lot, isn't it? 10 million people roughly, which means that now nearly 10 million people, and there probably be more by the time we're speaking, are living in the UK, which is quite a lot, much more, definitely much more than before World War II. And that changed things completely. And the people, we are trying to see that from the point of view of people who went to England from other countries, especially the former colonies, but not just so. And quite significant is a novel or a work by V.S. Naipaul called The Enigma of Arrival, 1987. The title in itself is quite telling, isn't it? And beautiful title, The Enigma of Arrival. Why? Because arriving in a new place is an enigma. You don't know where you are. People and features and places are explored with caution, as one would a civilized jungle. But let's go down to the starting point, the Race Relation Act 1976. This is, quoting, this is exactly the beginning of that act, an act to make fresh provision with respect to discrimination on racial grounds and relations between people of different racial groups, and to make in the Sex Discrimination Act 1975 amendment for bringing provisions in that act relating to its administration and enforcement into conformity with the corresponding provisions in this act. Maybe not so easy to follow. Well, that's obviously legal jargon, but in practical terms, that meant that for the first time there was a commission and a committee who had to look after any instance of, well, in theory, any instance of discrimination. Now, the starting point for us is the aftermath of World War II, when the so-called Windrush generation came to England. What a strange definition, isn't it? Windrush generation. How's that? Because that's the name Windrush of a ship, the Empire Windrush, that arrived in England in June 1948, carrying hundreds of West Indians who migrated to Great Britain in search of what? Well, what usually people migrate for. Work, better education, better opportunities. It's quite ironic that the Empire Windrush was a ship originally launched in Germany some 18 years before. And she was used to carry German immigrants to South America. It was also used as a cruise ship. And during World War II, she served as a troop ship. After the war, the UK seized it as a prize of war and renamed it Empire Windrush. And she remained in service for quite a long time. But let's get down to our point. In 1948, as we said, the Empire Windrush arrived at Tilbury, near London, with roughly 1,000 passengers who embarked at Trinidad, Jamaica, and Bermuda. Most of them were West Indians. Now, the Empire, this is quite interesting because the Empire Windrush was not the first ship to carry a large group of West Indian people to the United Kingdom, but there are other ships that arrived before. But for some reasons, this voyage hit the news. Everybody talked about that. And it became a symbol of post-war migration to Britain. And that's why British Caribbean people who came after World War II were generally referred to as the Windrush generation. Now, something strange, and well, strange for us today, maybe more to be expected at that time, happened because citizens from the former countries of the British Empire and Commonwealth began to seek work in the UK. And the point is that according to the 1948 British Nationality Act, immigration was permitted to people coming from the former colonies or the Commonwealth. So in theory, these people from the West Indies and other parts of the empire or the former empire should have been welcome. As it happened, it turned out that the government's preference was for European workers to fill shortages places. Historian Kenneth Lund writes, and this is quite important, by promoting employment schemes for white European workers to fill existing labor shortages, and by choosing to discourage, although in an informal manner, black workers from the Commonwealth, a clear set of preferences were displayed. In other words, the law allowed black workers or black people from the former colonies and the Commonwealth to come to England and find a job. But in practice, the government was discouraging them, positively discouraging them, and preferring white European workers. And the ministry concentrated on demonstrating that colonial citizens would make unsuitable workers in those instances where there were obvious shortages. But even then, the government of the ministry would say that they were not qualified workers. That's why white European workers were preferred. This is the British Nationality Act 1948, to which I was referring right now. After that, since the law opened doors, so to speak, dozens of thousands, and in the end, hundreds of thousands of people from India and Pakistan especially, but not just those countries, came to England. That, by the way, was on the wake of the significant participation of soldiers from the colonies in World War II. 1 million Indians, roughly, and about 16,000 from the Caribbean. And they said, they said it outright, we helped you during the war, and we now want to find a job and come to live in England or in the United Kingdom, if necessary. Now, that poses the problem, for the first time, posed the problem of the, how shall I put it, the living together or side by side of white and black people in the United Kingdom in great numbers, because that's the point. Not just a few people, not just a minority, but hundreds of thousands, and in the end, millions of people. And the problem is one of cultural relations and social relations. Central work here, one which you will know already, but it's good quoting it, is Culture and Imperialism, 1993, by Edward Said, the Palestinian writer. And Said points out how, in fact, since the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, many aspects of the social and cultural life of the European countries, England in special, have been inexorably linked to the colonies, or had been at the time he was writing. In fact, that can be seen already in novels of Charlotte Bronte, Dickens, Kipling, Conrad, Foster, you name them, to a lesser or to a greater degree. In many of their novels, for instance, there's clear awareness of how in those distant places a sort of new English life was taking place and shape. So they were not talking about great numbers of non-Europeans coming to England, but England was being modified there already. Now, this awareness, to give some profundity, some historical depth to this point, this awareness also shows in non-literary works. A case in point is Coleridge's articles on slavery, something that we saw in one of our previous webinars a couple of years before, if I remember correctly. This is a famous article of Coleridge, which appeared in The Watchman, 1796, on the slave trade. The title is significant. And there Coleridge denounced the deformities of a commerce which is blotched all over with one leprosy of evil. Now, the language is metaphorical and beautifully rhymed, as it befits a poet, but the sense is quite clear. The kind of commerce that was based on the slave trade was something evil, was leprosy, was a plague, especially because it came from imaginary wants, necessities. Imaginary meaning here unnecessary. This is an excerpt from the article in which Coleridge talks of the imaginary wants and the inhuman traffic on which slavery, on which they are based. And he mentioned West India specifically, from which sugars, rum, cotton, cocoa, coffee, ginger, many other conserves and many other things come, pointing out that none of these articles are necessary and they're not even useful. Sometimes they're harmful to the health. The point was by Coleridge and by other writers at that time that much of the leisure enjoyed by people in England, or in Europe for that matter, was based on the slave traffic. And of course, William Wordsworth too was quite aware that there was a problem with Black people. He noticed that on coming, and he remarks about that in the Prelude, on coming back to England after having been to France for a while. And he realizes that in England there was an issue, a hot issue at that time, which was centered on what he calls, if you look at that, the traffickers in Negro blood, something that goes to the heart. Now, of course, that had to do with the slave trade, which was officially abolished in 1833 throughout the British Empire. The former act had been passed in 1807. But as we said before, the point is that one thing is to pass a bill, pass a law. Another thing is to enforce it. And still another thing is that people stick to that, to what is understood by the law. In other words, good living between black and white people, living together in peace. It's quite clear that the color barrier was extant from the beginning in the British colonies, not to mention North America, the United States, especially the south of the United States, as we know. But now, after World War II, the influx of colored people into Britain proved to be something different. Now, for the first time in history, Britons were faced not with ethical issues, not with problems, general problems, but with living side by side with black people, working side by side with black people, having black people taking jobs. And many British people thought they were being invaded and that the immigrants would take away jobs from the true-born Britons and threaten to change the British lifestyle. Now, to talk about something slightly different, but clearly related to that as well, I want to mention now a book which is not so well known, was fairly well known some 50 years ago or 70 years ago. But let's start from something general. The English, as we know, have been famously or notoriously suspicious of and biased against foreigners. At least that was what happened when I went to England, for instance, as a young boy, as a student. It was still true to a certain extent. The English were famous for feeling superior to everyone else, even people from the continent, as they called Europe. It was a standard joke, in fact. But one thing were white European foreigners, another thing were black immigrants. To paraphrase George Orwell in Animal Farm, some foreigners are more foreigners than others. And a good literary and a funny literary example of difference was a book published in 1946. And the reason why I mentioned it is not only because of its contents, but also because of the date. Look, 1946, right after World War II, a couple of years before the Empire Windrush generation came to England. The book is called How to Be an Alien or a Foreigner by the Hungarian writer George Mikes. It's a funny book, classic of British humor used to be, and by 1966 it sold over 300,000 copies, quite a lot, isn't it? I've lost track of how many copies are sold since, maybe not so many, but the important thing is that Mikes, an immigrant from Hungary, pokes gentle fun at the English and their relationship with foreigners. Of course, alien, as I said, means non-English person. Now, the book is in two parts. The first part, How to Be a General Alien, deals with typical English topics as the weather. The English talk about the weather, or used to tea, how not to be clever, which is considered bad manners. The humor is quite obvious. How to compromise, how to learn to cue, a national passion, according to Mikes. And he's even more biting when it comes down to sex, because the chapter entitled Sex for the British is as follows. Continental people have sex lives. The English have hot water bottles. The second part, How to Be a Particular Alien, describes particular occupation from intellectual to bus driver, naturalized citizen, etc., etc., etc. That was being different on the part of a Hungarian, a white European, which could, poke fun at the English and at himself as a foreigner. Why? He might have been looked upon as different. He might have been made fun of sometimes, but surely he was not clearly discriminated against, not so much as it happened to black people coming to England. Now, the feeling of being different and having to justify oneself not for what one does, but for what one is. And that's exactly discrimination, is brilliantly rendered, painfully rendered also, in a poem by the Nigerian writer Wole Soyinka. It's a poem which is included in my anthology, and tells of the difficulty in finding a room to rent in London in the 1960s if one is black. Now we're going to see it now together. The speaker, probably Soyinka himself, presumably, but it could be any black person at the time, is calling from a telephone booth, one of those red telephone booths, so famous ones, in answer to an ad in a newspaper about a room to let. Telephone conversation, and he starts by the usual things. The price seemed reasonable, location indifferent, so quite good. The landlady swore she lived off premises. Nothing remained but self-confession. In other words, he was ready to take the flat. The landlady had agreed. But he says, "Madam," I warned, "I hate a wasted journey. I am African." Silence. Obviously, the words in bold are mine, in the sense that I made the highlighting. Silence. I'm an African. Voice when it came, and you can imagine the voice of the woman, lipstick coated, long gold rod cigarette holder pipped. Thought I was foully. He had been caught. He was African, not white. And the voice comes, how dark? He cannot believe his ears. I had not misheard. And then again, the woman's voice, are you light or very dark? Notice this is all in capital. Button B, button H, which were the two buttons, perhaps they're still there, I can't remember now, in the British red telephone booth at the time. And then it describes what is inside the box, what is outside the booth. And he says it was real. Shamed by ill-mannered silence, surrendered past dumbfoundment to back simplification, considerate she was, varying the emphases. Are you dark or very light? Revelation came. He finally knew. She wanted to know whether he was dark or light dark. You mean like plain or milk chocolate? He asks, presumably ironically, but the woman's accent is clinical, and he chooses West African sepia, which is a sort of reddish brown, and as afterthought, he tries to justify that. Down in my passport, that's what's written in my passport. Her accent was hard now. What's that? Conceding, don't know what that is. And he says, the speaker says, like brunette. And the woman, that's dark, isn't it? And finally, the speaker, bursts out, not altogether. Facially, I'm a brunette, but madam, you should see the rest of me. Palm of my hand, soles of my feet out of a peroxide blonde. Friction caused foolishly, madam, by sitting down, has turned my bottom raven black. One moment, madam, he can hear that she's going to hang up quite violently. That's the thunderclap about his ear. The woman is putting down the phone violently. Madam, I pleaded, wouldn't you rather see for yourself? Why don't you want to see me? And that's the end of the poem, and a beautiful one. Telephone conversation, Wole Soyinka, 1962. Let's remember, or let's not forget rather, that at that time it was not unusual to see signs outside a house saying rooms to let, no dogs, no coloreds, no colored people. Now, in the case of the writer from the Commonwealth, coming from the Commonwealth, so not so much of a stranger, because at least he came from the Commonwealth. In the case of V.S. Naipaul, things were quite different. In the first place, he came to go to Oxford on a scholarship. Scholarships were often given to brilliant West Indian students at that time. And this is the account in The Enigma of Arrival. Naipaul gives us an account of his arrival in England in 1950. And his view of London and the English way of life is that of a colonial, coming to the heart of the empire. Because we have to understand that, to put ourselves in Naipaul's shoes. He's been raised in the Commonwealth, in an English school, and he's finally come to the heart of the empire, as London was still felt to be in 1950. And this is what he says. After the grey of Atlantic, there was colour. Bright colour seen from the train that went to London. So colour, lights, especially electric lights, was something quite new for him. He wasn't used to that. Waterloo Station. He likes the size, the many platforms, the big high roof, and especially the lights. He was not used to that at home. He was used to the sunlight, but not so much to electric light, or not so much electric light. Then he goes directly to the boarding house in Earl's Court, where a room had been reserved for him before he actually went up to Oxford. And there what he noticed were the smells, new smells in the morning, smells to which he was not used at home in the West Indies. It was a cloying smell of milk, fresh milk, and the smell of milk was mixed with the smell of soot coming from outside, presumably, and that smell was overlaid with the smell of old dirt, cockroaches, so we might imagine that were not so nice. Quite typical of London in those days, and even much later on, as somebody might recall. These were the morning smells, quite ironic. The whole approach of Naipaul is ironic in a way. Irony is one way of feeling superior to what he doesn't like in the England of the time. He was living in a basement, and the wall was yellowish, shiny, wall light smell. They were all part of the wonderful London morning. I'd never been in a basement before. I had read the basement in books. And this room with an electric light burning on a bright sunny day seemed to me romantic. And here again, each reader might decide for themselves how much this is ironic or not. I was like a man entering the world of a novel, a book, entering the real world. So we see quite clearly Naples' experience of England is apparently less traumatic, much less traumatic. Maybe only apparently. But this is also part of Naples' character as a person and as a writer. He tends to be quite superior to whatever surrounds him. He's a very good writer and a very tough writer too. And he concludes by saying that he did find power, size, in Holborn, the Embankment, and especially Trafalgar Square. But after this grandeur, there was a boarding house in Earl's Court, the one he's just described, which was a bit seedy. So I grew to feel that the grandeur belonged to the past, that I come too late to find the England, the heart of the empire, which I had created in my fantasy, which means that the fantasy world, the dream world created by the English language, the English school, the English Commonwealth, crumbled in V.S. Naples when faced with reality. Now, Naipaul belongs to what had been called hyphenated artists. So he was Anglo-Caribbean, as Derek Walcott, as Naipaul himself, as Wilson Harris, George Lamming, Jamaica Kincaid, Jean Rice, before them. There were other hyphenated artists or writers. Obviously, we only see the most famous one here. Anglo-Indian, Salman Rushdie, Anglo-Pakistani, Hanif Kureishi, and of course, the Anglo-Nigerians, Wole Soyinka and Chinua Achebe. Incidentally, but not just so incidentally, 3 of them are Nobel Prizes, and the others are all very famous writers. We now come to the third of the writers we see in some detail, which is something quite different. I was going to say a far cry from the other 2, but maybe that's not so right, because in theory, Kureishi was not an alien, was not a foreigner. He was practically born in Britain. In fact, he had been born in Pakistan, but was taken to Britain when he was 4 months old. And his mother is English, so he spoke English perfectly. He wrote English perfectly. He was raised in England. He went to English schools. But even so, he was discriminated against. And in this essay, which is one of the most famous ones, or if not most famous, one of the best on this subject, and I heartily suggest for any class this essay, which is also fairly easy as compared to Wole Soyinka's poem, Telephone Conversation, which is difficult, admittedly. The second one, Naipaul, The Enigma of Arrival, is not so difficult, and this one is fairly easy. So it's good reading in our classes. There he says, it's autobiographical, painfully rich, but also painfully autobiographical essay. He says, or he recalls, from the start, I tried to deny my Pakistani self. It was a curse, which is a very strong word, isn't it? And I wanted to be rid of it. I wanted to be like anyone else, particularly when he saw his school friends joining the marches of Enoch Power's Paki bashing National Front in the late 60s. And he was born in 1952, if I remember correctly. And he suffered painfully humiliation in school. We're going to see that when he started to be a writer. But let's stick to the rainbow sign. The rainbow sign describes the process through which Kureishi learned that he could never be like everyone else in his mother's England, where he was born. But, and here comes the difficult part and painful part, he could not be like everyone else in Pakistan either. The same Pakistan from which his father had emigrated. And when he does go there, when he does visit Pakistan and go to his family of origin, and he meets his relatives, and they talk to him, and after learning what he suffered in England, they say, well, why do you want to stick to that cold little island? Why don't you come here? Here we are Pakistanis. We are a people. But you will always be a Paki. Paki being the slang, taboo word, derogatory word for Pakistani. And you will always be a Paki has become a standard way of saying. And in the rainbow sign, Kureishi also tells us about he considering to go back to Pakistan. After all, it was his country of origin. But he rejects that possibility, even though he finds many things in Pakistan much better than in England or London. But other things are not so much to his liking. Family could be too stifling, suffocating. in Pakistan, and also Pakistan Islamic theocracy was no place for a playwright. And in the end, he considers England his homeland, however painfully that comes to him as a revelation when he goes back to Pakistan. And he says, it is strange to go to the land of your ancestors, to find out how much you have in common with people there, yet at the same time to realize how British you are. And again, hyphenated artists or writers, Anglo-Pakistani. Which half? He don't know. The white British have to learn that being British isn't what it was. Britain and Pakistan have been part of each other for years, he writes in this essay. Their futures will be intermixed, but unfortunately, that's not what has been put into practice. He, in an interview, he says, I'm British. But being British is a new thing now. It involves people with names like Kureishi or Ishiguro or Rushdie, what it didn't before. Before the names were Dickens, Foster, Woolf, you name it. And we're all British too. But most of the critics in England don't understand that. There isn't any understanding of Britain being a multicultural place. That was said in 1998, if you look down there. They don't see that the world is now hybrid. And this takes us to another concept, the idea of newness, which has been used by Rushdie at the beginning, well, in Imaginary Homelands, another essay, which is quite another book, which is quite interesting to look at, 1991. But of course, at the beginning of the much more famous Satanic Verses, where Rushdie says, how does newness come into the world? How is it born? What fusions, translations, conjoinings is it made? How does it survive, extreme and dangerous as it is? And I highlighted in bold the three words fusions, translations, conjoinings, because they all point to putting things together, mixing them, which is exactly the word we are living in, whether we like it or not. Now, we're getting to the end of our talks, and it's not finished yet, but I wanted to point out a few critical works on the impact of migrations on Britain and Western countries in general. One is the funny, painfully funny, there ain't no black in the Union Jack, with an obvious rhyme, internal rhyme. Then a critical work, The Empire Writes Back, and many notions there. So if one wanted to start from a book which tells the relations between the former colonies of the Commonwealth and Britain, or for that matter, Western countries, that's the one book to look at. Then we have National Narration, Imaginary Homelands by Rushdie, which we mentioned already, and Migracy, Identity and Culture, 1994. But I would like to finish with another writer, Carol Phillips, not so well known as the other writers we mentioned so far, but very interesting because he's a British novelist, playwright, and essayist. He was born in St. Kitts, West Indies, but he was taken to England again when he was a few months old. And he's best known for his novels, and is often described as a Black Atlantic writer. Why is that? Because much of what he writes about is about the experiences of peoples of the African diaspora in England, the Caribbean, and the United States. In other words, as a writer, he is interested in what happened to Black people after they were forcibly taken from Africa centuries ago, and they were taken to Central America, South America, North America, and, well, of course, Europe later on. And he writes about that in a beautiful book, not long, by the way. So again, might be quite useful if you wanted to use it in class, called The European Tribe. And I want to finish with this because this time we have a writer, a Black writer, a British Black writer, talking about the European tribe. So not just the English or the British, but the Europeans. And what he does is to start a journey because he wants throughout Europe, because he wants to see how the average European behaves towards Black people or non-white people. Of course, his background is racial humiliation from his teachers at the Queen's College. Even though he was a British subject and he speaks English perfectly and he writes English perfectly, from a theatre director who replied to his play about the horror of the Middle Passage, the slave trade, is "Don't be bloody ridiculous," and from a London editor who calls him a jungle bunny. Because things have changed now, people would be much more careful to use such language. Political correctness has become quite current. But again, this is not to say that below or beyond language, discrimination still isn't operating. And he says, Phillips writes, in British schools, I was never offered a text that had been written by a Black person, or that concerned the lives of Black people. And so he asked himself, how was I to reconcile the contradiction of feeling British while being constantly told in many subtle and unsubtle ways that I did not belong? Which is quite wrong. If you've been born in a country and have been raised up there, especially the unsubtle ways. So the European Tribe is the account of Philip's one-year travels through Europe. And he examines Europeans as a sort of African anthropologist. So he treats the French, the British, the Soviets, the Spanish, not the Italian, but as a single white tribe determined to keep people of color down. Because that's what he notices in France, but might be in France, in Spain, everywhere, in fact, one way or another. And he is also very attentive, very sensitive to oppression in all its forms. Anti-Semitism, for instance, or religious fights, bigotry in Ulster, the suppression of writers in Warsaw and the Soviet Union. And I think that this book by Phillips, The European Tribe, is quite important because it gives us a view which is very different from the usual one, and which tells us that what happens and what happened in Britain is not so different from what is happening here, and that the discrimination against Black people or people of different color is something that takes place everywhere, not just in Europe, of course, even in other parts of the world. People keep being discriminating for racial, sexual, religious problems or issues. Despite my education, I found myself unable to engage with the Eurocentric and selfish history. And he ends by telling us, reminding us, in fact, for we Black people are an inextricable part of this small continent. Now, we don't know how small is really Europe. Might be small, as compared to other continents, might be not that small, but it's certainly a continent in which many different peoples and races and languages and sexes and religions have to live side by side. And I would stop now, and as usual, and I'd be glad to answer any questions if there were any. As usual, whether in English or in Italian. Thank you so much.
Grazie Arturo, grazie come sempre, e grazie per darci conto, diciamo, di come alcune cose hanno avuto inizio e anche, diciamo, di una loro contemporaneità che poi appunto ha un peso e forse un'opportunità invece di discussione anche a scuola di portata molto ampia, perché appunto essere sensitive to oppression in all its forms credo che sia un bellissimo modo per riuscire ad educare, a coeducare, anche ad ascoltare i ragazzi che sono nelle nostre classi, vuoi della scuola superiore, vuoi quelli e quelle che arrivano magari fino a te, fino a voi in università. Per cui il tema è grande come il mondo e però ecco, averlo collocato, avergli dato senso, trovo che sia stato un intervento molto bello. Quindi intanto ti faccio i miei complimenti, ne stanno arrivando anche.
Sei sempre molto gentile,
rispetto
molto
alle
generosa.
che ci hanno scritto. Ti porrei una domanda in italiano. Ecco, qualcuno chiede se ci potresti dire 2 parole sul rapporto tra gli scrittori neri nell'ambito britannico e del Commonwealth e quelli degli Stati Uniti. Quindi se ci sono, diciamo, degli spunti diversi, delle considerazioni in particolare da accendere, ecco, se ti senti di dire qualcosa su questo.
Sì, sicuramente c'è molto da dire, per ragioni di spazio non l'abbiamo detto oggi, però c'è da tenere presente che anzitutto, partendo dagli autori caraibici per esempio, che sono molto rappresentativi, anche perché il traffico degli schiavi comincia e la cosiddetta scoperta dell'America comincia nei Caraibi, quindi è un cerchio che si chiude. In gran parte prima emigrano, soprattutto nella prima metà del Novecento, emigrano negli Stati Uniti, ma anche dopo, per esempio Derek Walcott è emigrato negli Stati Uniti, Claude McKay, Louis Bennett, in un modo o nell'altro, fermandosi più o meno a lungo, sono andati negli Stati Uniti. La cosiddetta Harlem Renaissance, quindi il rinascimento nero di Harlem, ha avuto un grandissimo impatto. Autori come Wright, per esempio, come Richard Wright, hanno avuto un grandissimo impatto. Perché? Perché negli Stati Uniti il problema si pone della discriminazione, della coesistenza, si pone molto prima. Non dimentichiamo che i moderni Stati Uniti nascono da una guerra civile, quindi con perdite enormi, centinaia di migliaia di morti all'interno degli Stati Uniti, soprattutto bianchi degli Stati Uniti, tra il nord e il sud, per questioni razziali. Non che poi i problemi siano risolti dopo la guerra civile, lo sappiamo, però è molto significativo. Quello che accade nel sud degli Stati Uniti è qualcosa che arriva, cioè la discriminazione, che è arrivata almeno fino agli anni 60 con le famose lotte per la fine della discriminazione. Quindi sì, ci sono enormi rapporti. Tra l'altro c'è per esempio qualcosa di molto interessante, anche qui non ne abbiamo parlato per ragione di tempo, oltre ai grandi diciamo, autori, quelli più conosciuti, Leroy Jones per esempio, abbiamo citato Richard Wright, ma se ne potrebbero citare molti altri, sono nei nostri testi. C'è un intervento di Malcolm X negli anni 60, prima di essere ucciso in America, a Oxford, è invitato all'Università di Oxford e lui parte, Malcolm X lo sappiamo era in favore dell'intervento armato, perché non riteneva che non ci fossero altre vie d'uscita, però perché ricordiamo questo? Perché ha avuto un impatto enorme la sua conferenza a Oxford, ma perché ha anche un risvolto letterario, non certo per incitare alla violenza, ma perché Malcolm X parte dalla famosa frase, dal famoso monologo di Amleto, il to be or not to be, quando Amleto si chiede se contro i mali della vita sia meglio lasciarsi andare, o to take arms against the sea of trouble, cioè prendere le armi. E lui lo prende proprio, dice, come partendo da questo noi dobbiamo prendere le armi. Ovviamente era un momento storico particolare, era Malcolm X, però questo per dire come il rapporto a voler tracciare di questo tra autori degli Stati Uniti o comunque Stati Uniti e Gran Bretagna, Regno Unito, sia molto molto profondo.
Grazie. Grazie professor Cattaneo, purtroppo abbiamo finito il tempo, intanto scorrono dei ringraziamenti anche per il tema, gli spunti, l'utilità del tema, nel quale noi crediamo molto, quindi grazie tante
Grazie a voi.
Le aperture e gli spunti. Grazie anche a tutte le persone che sono state con noi e speriamo di ritrovarvi presto tutti quanti.
Un saluto a tutti o a tutte.
Buona serata.
Buona serata e buon lavoro.